And so this is the George Story lecture, and I'm going to be introducing Kate Story, George's daughter. She will say a few words about her father, George Story, for whom this April lecture each year is dedicated. Kate Story is George Story's daughter and the eldest of three of his children. She's born and raised on the South Side. She now lives and works as an uninvited guest of Treaty 20 territory, the Nogo-Jiwatnong, Peterborough, Ontario, the traditional territories of the Mississauga Ojibwe. She has published several novels, most recently the Governor General Literary Award finalist and N.L. Reid's finalist, Urchin, with Running Goat books and broadsides. Her latest publication is a debut short story collection, Fairy Back the Gifts, with Exile Editions. In October, Kate will be performing Anxiety here at the Festival of New Dance, weaving the epic poem Beowulf, whom we all know and love, with a gonzo exploration of growing up as the daughter of a famed Newfoundland lexicographer, the history of the English language, and roots of white supremacy in a modern world gone sideways. So we will now hear from Kate about her father, George Morley's story. So Kate, take it away. Kate, are you there? Alea, can you unmute Kate if she's muted?
She's on it. She's done it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, John.
Okay.
And thank you, Chris Sharp and Joe Scheuer for delivering this year's George Story Memorial Lecture, and to all of you for attending. It's a real honor for me to be asked to introduce this lecture. The house I was raised in is a tall house, and it's on the South Side Road, and my bedroom was in the front, up in the attic. And this gave me a terrific view of much of Old St. John's, the wooden houses, climbing the hills, Victoria Park, the green spire of St. Patrick's Church, those flat pinkish gray facades of the Grace and St. Clair's, the Basilica, and the business end of the harbor and the railway, and the muddy Waterford River was in the foreground, with its tidal bore, which I always found deeply exciting. When I first began researching my novel Urchin, which was more or less asked for by the wonderful Marnie Parsons of Running the Goat books and broadsides, as she evidently had a great deal more faith in my abilities than I myself possess, I realized I knew almost nothing of the history of the city I'd grown up in. Now, I set Urchin in 1901, and I thought surely I'd easily find information about housing and public services. I was in for a bit of a surprise, and the historians listening in are probably already laughing at me. My first problem was trying to find out if my protagonist and friends had indoor plumbing, electric lights, gas, and so on. One wants to know these things. It informs basic and fundamental facts about people's lives, as anybody who has done without these amenities knows very well. I managed to connect with the wonderful Jerry Penny, who to my sorrow passed away shortly before the book came out. Jerry answered endless emails from me about indoor plumbing, always with great good humor, and even he couldn't tell whether a house on the South Side Road in 1901 would have had it, or what sort of arrangement in lieu of it. And part of this was due to the fact that South Side Road was not officially part of St. John's at the time, I discovered, so the records are spotty. Melvin Baker was also very helpful, and finally, on his suggestion, I had a delightful 2-hour conversation with the marvelous and much mourned Helen Porter. She said that houses up the hill and down the road, even in her time, did not have gas, electricity, or plumbing. So that cinched it. My father's article, Building a St. John's Victorian House, it's a wonderful article. It confirmed many things I thought I already knew about the house I grew up in, and delivered fascinating facts of which I was completely ignorant. I merely thieved on that work to build a fictional older house in Urchin. I imagine the relief I felt at my great-great-grandfather White's ceiling-captain habit of keeping track of absolutely every detail as the house was being built was shared by my father. All hail to obsessive record keepers. They are an archivist's true friend. Next, I researched the Great Fires. Again, found I knew almost nothing about them. I knew they had happened, and that the third was in 1892, and it destroyed almost the entire city. That left 11,000 homeless. In a little over a month, government officials developed a rebuilding scheme for the city. Many of the houses put up were and are in the Second Empire style, which we know back home as the Southcott style, and typically mansard roofs, 3 stories with hooded dormers at the top. Many of those houses went up very quickly, and some I suspect were not meant to last, and then out of necessity did. I remember when I was a kid in the 1970s, I'd visit friends whose houses leaked incessantly around those hooded dormers. And the floors sagged and bounced like a shaky bog under countless layers of linoleum. The doors didn't shut and the stairs were treacherous, and one could see daylight around the window frames. And there was a certain smell to those houses. They were damp, there was smoke, coal dust, and an indelible scent brought on by generations of unceasing cookery. These were neighborhoods where there were corner stores, kids played on the streets, and interior dramas spilled out onto the pavement, loves and losses and conflicts, community. Our lecturers tonight will elucidate the history and context of housing in Newfoundland and Labrador with much more knowledge and eloquence than I ever could. I will happily leave it to them, and I look forward to it. I'm just going to quote briefly from the Historical Society's website biography of my father. The Newfoundland and Labrador Historical Society George Story Lecture is in honor of George Morley Story, 1927 to 1994, past president of the Society and winner of the Heritage Award in 1982 to 83. Dr. Story joined Memorial University's Department of English Language and Literature in 1954, where he established an international reputation as a lexicographer and Renaissance scholar, and pioneered the study of Newfoundland history, culture, language, and literature. His major Newfoundland publications include, with Herbert Halpert, The Wonderful Christmas Mummering in Newfoundland, and with Bill Kerwin and John Widdowson, The Dictionary of Newfoundland English, which came out in 1982. The dictionary, as we called it in our house, as fish equals cod, no need to name it, has become a touchstone for so many of us, artists and scholars and Newfoundlanders in general. It is not only a word hoard of the highest order, but it also illuminates the light and shadow of the lives of our forebears in that place. And I am sure I'm not alone in my gratitude for its existence. Dr. Story was very active in the public promotion and preservation of Newfoundland's cultural and historical heritage. He served as president of the Newfoundland Historic Trust, of the Newfoundland Historical Society, and was named the first chairman of the Newfoundland and Labrador Arts Council. He was appointed director of the J.R. Smallwood Center for Newfoundland Studies in '88, and in 1993 was named to the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada. Dr. Story was a recipient of several major honors, Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, Society of Antiquaries, and the Royal Society of Canada. In 1977, he was awarded the Canada Council's Molson Prize, and in '88 was appointed a member of the Order of Canada. For his distinguished scholarship and crucial influence on the development of Memorial University, he was posthumously awarded a Lit D just a few days after his death on May 9th, 1994. He would have been absolutely delighted by this lecture, marrying, as it does, Newfoundland culture, architecture, and history. Thank you and enjoy. I know I will.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to introduce our speakers now. So Joe Scheuer is retired from Memorial University, where she was an associate professor in the Department of Geography. As a geographer, Joe's interest has always been to explore cultural landscapes, both in the past and in the present. How and why does a new cultural landscape appear? And why and how does another cultural landscape disappear? For many years, Joe volunteered with the Museum Association of Newfoundland and Labrador, where she advised community museums about the stories that their collections might tell, and how to research those stories and how to translate them into exhibits. She and Chris have collaborated on two fine books of Newfoundland historical geography, Sweat Equity, Cooperative House Building in Newfoundland 1920 to 1974, which is published in 2016, and the more recent Corner, Windows, and Cul-de-sacs, The Remarkable Story of Newfoundland's First Garden Suburb, which was published in 2021. Chris Sharp was the geography professor at Memorial University for 40 years. His principal teaching and research interests were in contemporary and historical urban geography, heritage conservation, and the historical geography of Canadian and Newfoundland military activity. In addition to the two books mentioned by Joe Scheuer, in her biographical note, he and Joe also collaborated in the writing of a chapter on wartime St. John's in Occupied St. John's, A Social History of a City at War, 1939 to 1945, and that was published in 2010. Chris lived in Churchill Park for almost 3 decades in a house built by a member of the Bonaventure Housing Cooperative. This was the impetus for the research that led to both sweat equity and corner windows. Since retiring in Shelburne, Nova Scotia in 2015, he has served on the boards of the Heritage Trust of Nova Scotia and the Shelburne Historical Society. So now I turn the evening over to Chris and Joe, and we're very much looking forward to their presentation.
Well, I will start off, and first of all, to thank the Historical Society for inviting us, and particularly to the George Story Memorial Lecture, and Kate, who've given a wonderful background to our presentation, and thank you very much. So let's look at the title slide to begin. We're going to talk about 2 books tonight because they're interrelated. And we're talking about housing in St. John's and housing out around the island. So that's what we're concentrating on. First of all, we want to look at what needs St. John's had for housing and what was the problem and how we're trying to solve their problems. And then we'll look first of all at the fire map. The fire map is basic to understanding St. John's housing history. And the largest area of the worst housing was, if you look on this map, it was that block on the left side. No, Chris. It was the block on the left side of the map. You see that peak going northward, that's Longs Hill. So our particular interest was an area west of Longs Hill, from New Gower Street north to Central. That dashed line you see west of Longs Hill is New Gower Street. So we're looking at just the block of houses and tenements to the north of that street. And we mention that in lots of things we talk about. And if we look up at the legend here, in 1817, there weren't many people living in this area west of Longs Hill and north of New Gower. And it was the same in the 1846 fire. And it was in the same in 1992 fire. People were there because if you look at the next slide, before 1846, there was virtually no one living west of Longs Hill, north of New Gower. But after the fire, it was decided that where New Gower Street commenced and where for the accommodation of tradespeople and others who required to be near their place of business, it was agreed that wooden erections should be permitted to be made, and then determined that Gower Street would be extended to Flower Hill Firebreak. And so these were the tenement houses that were allowed to be built after 1846. Now, when the fire of 1892 happened, I told you it didn't go west of Longs Hill or north of New Gower, so these buildings weren't burned. And by the time we come to the 1950s, they are still there like this, 100 years old. Now, this is James Street. We'll meet James Street again. And we should look at the public health. It was a very important element in considering the quality of housing. If you look at this, you can see that the death rate, the tuberculosis, and infant mortality were all very much higher than other parts of the province. Now we can turn to to Gosling. Here we have the attempts of various organizations to add and contribute to the housing in the city. So Mayor Gosling and his council got a grant from the government in 1920, and they built 22 houses on Kitty Bitty Road and Cavell Avenue. And the Dominion Cooperative Housing Association built 33 houses on Merry Meeting about the same time. And then we have the Railway Employee Welfare Association. They built more than 100 houses on Craigmillar and Topsail Road in the 1930s. Now, the attempt was that these houses would be a small, sort of small and modest for modest and low income housing. It didn't work for Kittyvitty or Craval or Merrymeeting Road. But for the railway houses, of course, they were made for railway people and designed for their incomes. So that was successful. But none of these initiatives did anything to improve the quality of housing downtown. Then a random event occurred, and random events are important in planning. They're not planned, but they often dig the planning along. In 1921, the first Rotary Club was formed in St. John's, and as a social project, the Rotarians investigated conditions north of New Gower, and they were horrified with what they found. So they suggested this whole matter of housing in this area is bristling with difficulties, legal and otherwise, and I propose that the town call in an expert in slums and town planning to tell us how best to gouge out the rotten core which exists in the center of our city. So the person that they invited was Arthur Darzell. He was trained in the United Kingdom as an engineer and a sanitary inspector. And when he came to Canada, he was a planning advisor to the Canadian government. He came in 1926 to St. John's, and he looked at that area north of New Gower Street, and he said it could be improved if you did proper planning techniques, and he gave the City Council a lesson in planning. And he also said, as a precautionary note, a community can buy health if it wants to, but it has to pay the deficit on poor health, whether it wants to or not. The next is a page from the assessment roll. Chris? That's it. In 1934, so this is interesting. On the left column, you see one name entered. That is the person who owns the entire of James Street, which you saw on that slide. And over on the far right, you see it says W and S in lots of those places. That means water and sewer. In all the units except one, it says no W and S if you follow your line down that column. The slant line across the graph says not fit for habitation and so recorded. Now the second line from the left is a list of names which tell you that although they're not fit for habitation, they're completely occupied, every unit. So there was a medical officer of health, and his job was to survey the buildings in town, and he went to every council meeting and handed in his list of houses he wanted condemned. But the council frequently wouldn't condemn those houses that he sold them to, because they said we have no alternate accommodation to provide for those people. And I suspect this still goes on in some cities in Canada today. Next, Chris. Yes, Stanley Pickett was almost the first planner in St. John's. They decided to have a city planner in the 1950s. And this was a situation in the 1950s in that area. But we also have shack towns. Now, during the 1920s and 30s, almost every big city in Canada, I suppose, had a periphery of shack towns because life was grim in the 20s and 30s. And so did St. John's. But if you wanted and were really determined to have a house and got yourself a piece of land and then just built it yourself without services. And this is what happened here. But don't dismiss shack towns. They are very, very important. And in fact, by the 1950s, more than 200 of these houses had been built that accommodated 200 families in St. John's, and that was more than the city council had managed to build. Now we're going to switch gears and go out around the province. look at the Commission of Government. So we're now in the 1930s, and the Commission has arrived. So they were very, very keen. There was a controversy. They wanted to move the dependence on the fishery and make it less so. And this was a very controversial idea. But they hoped to do this by developing cooperative things. So the idea was to have 36 new land settlements. And these would have an air of cooperation about them, because once they got people removed from St. John's and other towns, and even from the fishery, and taken on to these land settlement projects and build houses, that in a few years they would be productive agricultural places. So that was what they did. And they brought in advisors to work for them who had been St. Felix Xavier University, where Father Moses Cody was the big chief person promoting cooperative work and the cooperative movement. The next slide. John Gorvin.
There we go.
Yeah. John Gorvin then was hired again in 1938 because he was experienced in cooperation in other parts of the empire. He was brought in and he was going to head up a cooperative division and really rural reconstruction in Newfoundland on a cooperative basis was what he wanted to do. And he also brought in Mary Ellicott Arnold. She was a person who had great experience in cooperation in the United States and also in Nova Scotia. In Nova Scotia, she had just helped mentor 11 miners build their houses in a cooperative project in Tompkinsville. And when she came to Nova Scotia, she and her partner, what was her partner's name? Mabel Reed, they helped people build 8 houses at McCarthy Ridge near Maryland. But however, the budget was cut. Gorvin went back to Britain and Mary Arnold returned to the States. So that was that. But however, the idea of cooperation was still there, and the cooperative division was still there, and it established more than 1,000 study clubs across the island to teach the principles and values of cooperation. And especially on the West Coast, these study clubs were very strong, partly because of William Keogh. He was a dedicated cooperative field officer, and we will meet William Keogh again later on this evening. One cooperative field officer reported to St. John's. This is what he said when he reported to his boss in town: working hard, no money, no clothes, no grub, frozen to death, expect to die from TB in 2 years. Next, we can come back to St. John's and see what the Commission of Government was doing there, and we meet John Meany. 84 years ago tonight, actually, on April 27th, 1939, City Councillor John Meany proposed a possible solution to the problem of the poor housing in the inner city. He said, if the individual cannot, go back one, Chris, if the individual cannot and the capitalist will not bid to meet the normal requirements of decent housing, then the state and the municipality must take cognizance of the situation and make available the use of public funds or public credit to enable others to build for those who cannot build without assistance. The plan I am proposing is to arouse our city from its death-like apathy, from its reproachable lethargy, from the slumber of industrial and social death. So his plan was a low-interest loan from the Commission of Government and reduction of the tax rate to permit the city to build 500 houses. They were to be offered on a rental purchase plan and priced at market value. Meany acknowledged that they probably would be beyond the price range of the very low income, but he said at least there would be more houses in the housing stock of the city. He had two caveats. He wanted no new organization. He said nothing, no new group was needed to build these, and they should be built within the city where there are services. The council agreed, and they sent Meany's plan up to the Commission of Government, who refused to consider it. Next.
Jesus Christ.
When the war came to St. John's in 1939, it brought American and Canadian troops and diplomats who criticized the downgraded conditions of St. John's housing, just as Lady Hope Simpson and Dr. Jones did. Oh, no. Can we go back one, Chris?
Where do you want to go? You want to go
No,
back?
I want to get back here. Stop. Stop at Lady Hope Simpson.
Oh, yes, that's where I was going. Okay.
Okay. Lady Mary Jane Hope Simpson, who was wife of the governor at the time, she said, "A horrid little town, really. It might be a beautiful little capital of this beautiful island, but it is just a dirty, foul-smelling slum. The dirt and carelessness are preventable. It's a town without self-respect. No one seems to have cared enough for it to think and plan and spend for it." The Dr. Robert Jones came through town in 1937, and he said, "The city of 1,000 stinks, millions of flies, dirt, squalor, chronic malnutrition, very little middle class here, people being either very poor or very rich. Most of the city lives in miserable shacks, and only about 1/3 have plumbing or sewerage, I'm told. I suspect that is an underestimation. Sewage in pails, which is put outside at midnight. A modern hygienist would go crazy here." Okay, stop. Then the war came, and it brought Canadian and American people here, and they made terrible critical remarks, just like Lady Hope Simpson and Dr. Jones. These comments, embarrassing as they were, made Newfoundlanders realize that pre-war conditions could no longer be tolerated. Can we have, yes, Humphrey Walwyn was the governor, and he said in a rather terse manner, Newfoundlanders were dazzled by American dollars, hygiene, and efficiency. And Edward Roberts, some years later, reflected, "The war brought prosperity, a happy condition unknown to Newfoundlanders for 20 years. A rising tide of expectations, of demands for a better life, swept across the country. Most importantly, the war restored self-confidence. A country and a people who had known nothing but adversity and who had forfeited their self-government as the penalty for bankruptcy regained their pride and determination." The Commission of Government rejected Councillor Meany's proposal a second time in 1941, but this time they made a suggestion. They said, what about large employers? They should be asked to gather data on the housing conditions of their employees. The council took up that suggestion, and they asked the Commission of Government to authorize the creation of a commission to undertake a housing survey of all the houses in the city. And this was done in 1942. Now, there were two mandates to the commission that they invented. So the commission decided it would investigate the state of housing in the city and develop a plan to provide houses for those unable to do so themselves. So that again was targeting the people down in the inner city. And the second plan was very grandiose, as you will see, to make recommendations regarding the general replanning of the city. So we can look at the Commission of Government. It was very cleverly constructed and very generously constructed. If you glance through it, you'll see it had representatives from all the churches, from all the charity groups, from trades and unions and Memorial University College. And at the bottom, Mr. Justice Brian Dunfield of the Newfoundland Supreme Court was to be the chair. Between November 1942 and January 1944, this commission issued 6 reports, which ultimately changed the face of St. John's. This is what Dunfield said in his inaugural address. Nothing has a greater effect upon the health and general social condition than the housing standard. It must be admitted that in this respect, we fall very short indeed. In our town, even substantial houses too often present an appearance of dilapidation and disorder, more appropriate to a temporary mining town than to a capital. Dunfield believed a different sort of city was necessary, and he said it was possible. But first, the scope of the problem had to be identified. So, Dunfield got the Boy Scouts to deliver a questionnaire to every house in town. This was gathering data. And the questionnaires asked everything from income of a household to how many people slept in a bedroom, and even more. They got responses from 4,500 houses, which contained 5,500 families. 16% of the houses, occupied by 29% of the respondents, were classified as immediately condemnable. And most of those houses were in the densely populated area immediately north of New Gower. And Dunfield had something more to say. The next, Chris. He said to create, no, it's children, the one about children.
It's there, Joe.
Okay, to create a class of surroundings which have not been yet seen in St. John's by emulating the modern Canadian and American suburb, where houses are set well back along streets lined on both sides with a broad strip of lawn, which the tenants and owners take pride in keeping trim and neat, because children, like cows, ought to be on grass and not on sidewalks. This was the point of departure for the modern planning of St. John's. Now, he had a bold scheme. What we have put before the public in this report is a bold scheme for, in effect, doubling the living space of the town by making a new planned garden suburb in the valley north of the town. And let us, as a community, look a generation ahead and make a bold, united effort and lay our plans for more space and better houses once and for all. And his plan was to expropriate 800 acres and build 1,000 houses outside the city boundary. And the initial funding for the project was the Commission of Government and the city. They would all be single-family houses because a house in a range is an undesirable survival of the past. The trend in public desire is unmistakable. Even today, even a man of small means wants a house he can walk around with a bit of garden and a place for the garage he hopes to have one day. So this is, let's have the map. This is what we see then. You might recognize this, I hope. There is Long's Pond and Burton's Pond in the middle, Empire Avenue on the southern edge, Torbay on the right, Freshwater on the left. What is missing there is Elizabeth Avenue. All right. At that time, at that time, there were about 300 properties in this area. And you see most of the houses were on the roads in and out of town. A couple of big farms like Halliday's, which is a university campus now, and some smaller ones. So this is where they were going to build. Dunfield believed in a socialist principle. Landowners should not be permitted to enjoy unearned increment to the value of their lands. So the land was to be expropriated by the St. John's Housing Corporation at its current market value. People protested, about 50 of them, and one even threatened to protest to the king. But the Commission of Government ignored them. Others said that development was so far out in the country that no one would want to move there. And the public called the plan Dunfield's folly. However, it was going to go ahead. Now, in this map, we see the proposed area where the garden suburb would be compared to the existing footprint of St. John's. So you can see what a huge project it had. It was just enormous. So the first thing they had to do was attend to services. There was sewer along for Empire Avenue, but it was at a higher level than the valley down below that they were going to put this housing in. So they had to drain the valley toward Kitty-Vitty. And the engineer knew that Harvey's had made an attempt to build a tunnel from the harbor to Kitty-Vitty Lake in the 19th century. So they called up some miners from St. Lawrence, who took a year to dig out and complete the tunnel over 1,000 feet. And you can see it in that dashed line. The sewer tunnel is hugely important. It opened up the whole Northern Valley for future development. So remember that for later. The war was on and supply chains were just as they are today after COVID, I suppose. So the St. John's Housing Corporation built a pipe and block plant on Freshwater Road, a sash and door shop on Lambs Lane, and of course, the other big project, as well as the sewer, was Elizabeth Avenue as the big circumferential road, almost like a ring road for St. John's at the time. And there is the bridge that you're all familiar with on Elizabeth Avenue today. And who was going to actually design the houses? Paul Machino, a graduate from the School of Architecture at Toronto. In 3 years, from July 1945 to 1947, the corporation built 244 houses and based on 31 designs that Machino came up with. And you will recognize these houses everywhere in Churchill Park area. And some of you may live in them as well. All single-family dwellings. Machino was responsible also for the first purpose-designed apartment here in the Churchill Square area. And they were actually dedicated for use by the veterans coming home from the war. And remember that for later on. You'll notice the signature of Machino was his corner windows. You see them everywhere in all these buildings. If you've ever been in a Machino house with corner windows, you will know how wonderful the light is in a room. He also had other modern ideas. He had full basements, built-in kitchen cabinets, bathrooms, and central heating. Plus, every house had a fireplace because Newfoundlanders said, although we have central heating, we need a fireplace as well. A house is not a home without a fireplace. So then it was shovels in the ground and the construction began. So they were building multiple houses on multiple streets, all at the same time. It was absolutely astonishing. So this is what your streets in Churchill Park looked like at that time. Going to the country to see the houses on Sunday afternoon was the entertainment. And this was always reported on in the paper on Monday morning. Now here we have the houses in Village B. And just to explain, the concept, the grand idea was to have 3 villages, A, B, and C. A would have been where Lawton's is up on the east end of Elizabeth. Village B is Churchill Park, and Village C would be at Somerville by opposite the pub. But only Village B was completed. But you can see Elizabeth Avenue, that broad road, the commercial road, the Main Street road running across, and you can see cul-de-sacs and curvy roads, and you can see a lot of space between houses and around houses. And this was really the image that he wanted. And I will tell you that all the commercial activity was restricted to Elizabeth Street, And if you go around Churchill Park residential streets, you will not find a corner store. However, he managed to get supermarkets in each of the 3 village sites on Elizabeth Avenue instead. Unfortunately, the houses cost more than the initial estimates. They certainly weren't going to be any good for people of low income, and even they were difficult for people with middle income, and they became really occupied initially by people of quite high incomes. But they were so expensive, and they were tried to actually cut back and save money on building them and all of this. The sales were sporadic. The problem became to be in trouble, and the Commission of Government noticed. So Commissioner James said, sooner or later, the government will have to put its hand in its pocket and produce a lot of money for the demolition and reconstruction of slum property. And I should like to see us reserve our resources for this state, i.e. the slum, leaving the present campaign for rehousing the middle classes to private enterprise. And only a month later, another commissioner, Walsh, said, I recommend that great caution should be exercised in the further financing of this project by the government. It seems to me that for the year 47-48, the corporation should proceed to install roads, sewage, and other services in the whole area and complete the apartments and houses already under construction. When the area has been properly laid out, one should expect to find that private builders will wish to acquire land for the erection of houses at their own cost. It is immaterial from the government's point of view whether the houses are built by the corporation or privately, if the building is in accordance with plans approved by the corporation. So the corporation's role as a house builder was terminated. That was the end of the construction in this project in that area in the Northern Valley. So what happened next? And we'll ask Chris what happened next.
Thank you, Joe. And my apologies to everyone. After this PowerPoint behaved perfectly during the preamble, it's now decided to randomly go into slideshow mode, which is why I have to keep going back. My apologies, Joe. I know I made things difficult for you. All right, remember the discussion that we had about the Commission of Government's interest in cooperation as a housing initiative, and Mr. Bill Keogh and the study groups across the country. But while the St. John's Housing Corporation was busy building houses in the Northern Valley, cooperative housing initiatives were appearing elsewhere in the country, partly as a reaction to the activity of the St. John's Housing Corporation. And the first quote here, the president of a war veterans cooperative in Cornbrook, writing to the Commissioner for Home Affairs, basically saying, where's ours? We see all this money being spent on housing in St. John's, and we're out here in Cornerbrook, and we don't have any of this. The other quotes you can read after it's being recorded, you can read it later. But the important thing is that the veterans were aware of what the St. John's Housing Corporation was doing in St. John's, began to reevaluate their own housing situation. And in 1942, with advice and encouragement from Bill Keogh, 30 employees of the Bowater Company formed a Humber Housing Cooperative and asked the Commission of Government for financial help to build their houses. The government was very reluctant to do that. It didn't have a policy. It was reluctant to spend money on housing in any case. And of course, these men in Cornerbrook had no collateral. But probably with the encouragement of field worker Bill Keogh, the government decided that they would go ahead and they would make a loan to this group. But that set a precedent. And very soon, three other groups of veterans in Cornerbrook, two formed in 46, one in 53, and they built houses. So the Townsite veterans, the Westmount veterans, and the Eastmount Housing Corporation. The Humber Co-op, of course, was the first one that was formed in 1942. So these examples of houses built by each of these groups. There was also another veterans group in Grand Falls that built 15 houses on Memorial Avenue. Group was formed in 1946, and the very substantial houses here on Memorial Avenue in 1950. But none of these projects had any impact on the dilapidated housing in downtown St. John's. But then came Confederation. And with Confederation came CMHC and the Section 49 shared cost agreement program, 75% of the cost borne by the federal government, 25% by the provincial government. This brought slum clearance, as it was called at the time, the building of houses, which we would now call public housing, and the houses on Hoyles, Empire, Anderson, Elizabeth Avenues, they all date from this early public housing development. You see, the agreement was signed in June of 1950, just over a year after Newfoundland joined Confederation. So that was the slum clearance program, public housing in 1950. In 1952, Bill Keogh, who has now joined the provincial cabinet and has become the Minister of Fisheries and Cooperatives, decides that he is going to create a government-funded cooperative housing program, not just for veterans, but one that would be available for everyone. This was largely a result of the lobbying that the veterans did, but Keogh saw the advantage of doing this for the entire province. So this is what he said: you haven't got the money. Basically, he's talking about a down payment. If you haven't got a down payment, you can't afford a house on the commercial market. The government will help you build your own, as long as you do it by yourself. And the key to his policy was the monetization of sweat equity. That is, paying the men who built the houses for the time that they spent on the houses. This was an idea, Joe has already mentioned. It was initiated by Mary Arnold in Tompkinsville in 1937, and she brought this idea with her to Newfoundland when she came to work with Gorvin. Unfortunately, the pre-Confederation co-ops that we've seen already, the ones in Corner Brook and Grand Falls, they missed out on this program and they didn't get the advantage of this. So Keogh explained why it was necessary, and hundreds of people took up the challenge to build themselves a home. 60 separate cooperative groups were formed in the province, and they added more than 500 houses to the province's housing stock. 391 of them were in St. John's. And this is how Joe and I, almost completely by accident, discovered the co-ops. Looking in Joe was looking in the building permit records in St. John's for some completely different purpose, and started seeing references to cooperative housing societies. And in this case here, the one at the top, the Coronation Housing Society, you've got the names of all of the people who are members, you've got the lot numbers and the type of house. For Edinburgh, they obviously hadn't got very far along in the planning process, and just their name is mentioned there. Now, where did they find the land to build the houses? Well, remember that in 1947, St. John's Housing Corporation's days as a house builder were over. Government shut them down, but they had expropriated 800 acres of land north of Empire Avenue, and it was all serviced. And so the cooperatives were able to buy land either from the Newfoundland government or from CMHC in these areas that had been left over after the demise of the housing corporation. And this is the first co-op house that was built in St. John's. It looks a little different now than it did in the 1950s. And you see that Bill Keogh, who was the minister, turned the sod for that house in October of 1952. Many of you will know this house. It's immediately north of the Rennies River on Carpathian Avenue. The interesting thing about this slide is the advertisement. Because by 1953, the idea of cooperatives building houses in St. John's was so familiar that the Lennox Furnace Company was using, in this case, the Coronation Cooperative Housing Group as part of their advertising campaign, basically saying, look, Coronation's smart, they bought Lennox, you should do the same. These are the movers and shakers. These are the people who shepherded the co-op members through years of difficulties that they faced. Joe Ryan from CMHC, MAS, the Department of Municipal Affairs and Supply, and of course the Ted Russell, Director of Cooperatives, and Janes, the Director of Co-op Housing, they were in the Department of Fisheries and Cooperatives. We found and talked with Joe Ryan, who had been the head of St. John's CMHC office between 53 and 60. We wish we could have talked to the others, but at least we got hold of Joe. And I'll tell you in a few minutes why Joe Ryan and as head of the CMHC office was very important. Now let's look at the process of how you built the co-op house. First of all, you had to form a group. And provincial legislation required a minimum of 9 members. So some groups advertised in the papers. On the other hand, there were people who wanted to join co-op groups, didn't know who to contact, so they put ads in the papers. Notice that the ad on the left stipulates the minimum salary and the ready cash that was needed if you wanted to be a member. And the reason for this, I'll explain in a minute as well. Now, each group, as a first step, had to form a study club. This was absolutely a critical component of the cooperative method. You had to meet, you had to learn about cooperative history and theory. Then you had to choose house designs, you had to learn how to build a house, you had to deal with financing. And most of these groups met at least once a week, sometimes twice, for a year. And the meetings, certainly in the beginning, were all attended by a co-op field worker from the Department of Fisheries and Cooperatives. Now, where did the co-op members come from? Well, here's a list of co-ops at the top part of the slide shows that some of the co-ops were formed by men who worked all in the same place. And where possible, being sensible, they tried to get people who had plumbing, electrical, or carpentry skills. And then there's the question of what sort of people were they? And you can see that in the Century co-op, there were all sorts of different occupations. Most of them we call them blue collar. At Crossfield, 2 teachers, 2 welders, a machinist, snack bar owner, a manager, and a clerk. And here is one of the teachers. He was the president of the Crossfield Housing Cooperative. You want to know what sort of person was involved in, enjoyed the benefits of the cooperative housing program? Well, here is a classic example. He was principal of Brenton School, but had not had an opportunity to save for a down payment. And he told Joe and I when we interviewed him that without the program, it would have been years before he would have been able to buy a house. So he moved on from being president of the Crossfield to being president of Memorial from 81 to 90. And he lived in this house that he built with his own hands from 1955 until his death in 2008. Now, here's the cost of a cooperative house based on a typical co-op in St. John's. Building costs, and you'll see that labor at $2,000 is added into the cost of the house, just as it would be if you had paid a contractor to build the house. Labor valued at $1 an hour. And then the members' personal contributions, well, there's the $2,000 appearing again as a contribution along with the share capital. So the labor is added to the cost of the house to increase the value of the house. And then the labor is taken off as well as share capital, just as a down payment would have been. So a house that was valued at $9,000 was bought for just over $6,000 because of the monetization of the sweat equity. The government paid very strict attention, as did CMHC, to the progress of co-ops. And this is an example of a monthly report, this one for Shamrock in 1957. And you'll see on the left-hand side, the house, the lot numbers are shown with an estimate of how much it was going to cost to finish the house, the names of the owners, the amount of share capital that they have invested. And then in the last column is the labor, share capital to date, brackets, labor. And this represents the number of hours that each of these men had devoted to building a house. The average number of hours in all the co-ops across Newfoundland was about 1,700. In this case, you'll see that one of these men is almost 2,900 hours. Now, to put this in perspective, remember that all these men had to have full-time employment, because if they hadn't been fully employed, they would not have been eligible for the program. So within 2 years, which was the length of time that the province would loan you the money, you had to spend the equivalent of 75% of a year's work. If, let's say, 1,500 hours was an average, that's the equivalent of 3/4 of a year's work that you had to put in within 2 years on evenings, weekends, and holidays, and as much as possible in daylight hours because there was no electricity in the areas to power lights. An amazing contribution that these men had to make. Now, what happened was after the initial application, if a group's application was accepted by the provincial government, they would agree to advance a 2-year blanket mortgage, a mortgage to the entire group. But it would only do that if CMHC had already looked at the application and had agreed that at the end of the 2 years, they would advance individual mortgages to the co-op members. So that the pre-approval by CMHC was a necessary condition for the group to move ahead. And the critical factor was that CMHC would not approve a mortgage if PIT, the principal, interest, and taxes, exceeded 23% of the household's gross income. Generally, only the man's income was counted, but if the wife had a permanent job, up to 23% of her income could have been counted as well towards the family gross. Now, all men were expected to work on all the houses using whatever skills they possessed. The original idea was that the lots for the houses would not be drawn until all the houses were finished. This was to ensure that every man would do his best job on every house because he didn't know if he was working on his own or somebody else's. That didn't last very long. Most of the houses, most of the co-op members allocated their houses and the lots in advance of construction. Now, once all the houses had reached the walls up and roof on stage, and the CMHC inspectors had signed off on them, then CMHC would advance the individual mortgages. The group would pay off the blanket mortgage, so the province would get its money back and could loan it out to somebody else. But all the houses in the group had to be at the same stage of completion before CMHC would do this. So this required that during the construction phase, true cooperative discipline had to be maintained in spite of all the inevitable personal issues and problems that arose. There could be no laggards, no shirkers, and the CMHC inspectors played an extremely important and vital role in keeping the groups together. Now, one of the things that the study groups had to do was choose what house design they were going to use. And here is where the CMHC inspectors and the field workers from the co-op division played a very important role because they would know how much these houses cost and they would help the men to choose. Many of the houses were taken from CMHC pattern books. These were widely available in Canada. All the houses in the books were designed by architects, and our man Paul Machino, who designed the corporation houses, had 3 of his designs picked for inclusion in these books. None of his CMHC designs were used in Newfoundland. But these plans could be bought for $10 from the CMHC offices, so they were all very affordable. This is the only picture we have of sweat equity in practice. These are 2 photographs that were given to us by members of the Newtown Co-op. So this is on Newtown Road, just near Lions Park. You probably won't recognize anyone that's in there, but one of the men that's there is Mr. Cody of Cody's Ironworks. Now, when all the houses were complete, passed inspection, individual mortgages were issued, the Co-op Society was disbanded by the Co-op division. And so starting in the late 1950s and going through the 60s, the newspapers would have these ads indicating which of the corporations had finished their work and had been dissolved. So these were unlike cooperatives that many of you would know about now, the so-called continuing cooperative, where the co-op continues to own the houses. These were building co-ops, and once the houses with the building phase was over, they became individually owned houses. And after that happened, you would then get a letter, in this case, from the Deputy Minister of Municipal Affairs, congratulating everybody on the work that they had done. signature, that's Clarence Powell, being sent to the Secretary of the Bonaventure Housing Cooperative. Now, there were some co-ops that never got past the early discussion stage. But of all of the co-ops that got to the stage where they were recognized and authorized by the government to proceed and were accepted into the program, not a single one failed. It took a great deal of work, chivying, herding cats by the inspectors, but every one of them managed eventually to get the task completed. One place where a place other than St. John's where the co-ops had a very significant role was in Gander. In 1945, the RCAF turned the airport back over to the Commission of Government. In 1946, it was designated the International Airport for Newfoundland. And immediately after Confederation, the Department of Transport started to expand the airport, extending the runways, and basically bulldozing all the residential accommodation on the airfield. So hundreds of families had to find new accommodation, and many of them found that the provincial co-op program was a good one, and 11 different groups, you see the names of them here, built 111 houses in the town site of Gander. You won't be able to see the map of St. John's within the Churchill Park area, but you can see the identity of the co-ops across the top. In the greater St. John's area, there were 42 cooperatives, and 30 of them built their houses in what would have been villages A and C, part of the 800 acres that had been expropriated by the St. John's Housing Corporation in 1944. Slim Leonard used to live at the top of Baltimore Street, was a CMHC inspector that Joe and I interviewed. He's one of the unsung heroes of the sweat equity program. He told us that his phone would ring early in the morning in the middle of dinner. People in the co-ops would call him for advice at any time of the day. But this is his generous and honest appraisal of the program. None of the co-ops fell down. Nice little houses that served the purpose of the people who built them. Then two quotes at the bottom. The first one is from William Cody, and the one below is from his wife. And Joe and I think were really touched when she told us at the end of the interview that in all the things we've done in our 67-year marriage, that was the best, meaning the decision to join the Newtown Cooperative and have that house. Now, Joe Ryan told us, Joe Ryan of CMHC, he said the enduring strength of the Newfoundland housing cooperatives was that they built a community before they built their houses. And here is a classic example of how that comradeship survived. I don't know whether all co-ops survived as well as the Newtown, but the Newtown was formed in 1953. On 31st of July, 2007, the surviving members of the Newtown Co-op unveiled this plaque that they'd had commissioned. It's on a rock at the entrance to Lions Park at Newtown Road. So the surviving members are there. The picture in the middle at the top, I think that's Mr. Ryan on the left, but the green banner was made by one of the wives while the co-op was being built. After the construction, it was rolled up and put behind the gyprock in the wall of one of the houses. And it was discovered by accident during renovations of the house sometime in the early 2000s, and they brought it out to display on the day of the ceremony. So here's what we've been talking about: housing initiatives in Newfoundland. 5 different programs going back to 1916, coming up to the end of the co-op program, which was in the 70s, but it was sputtering and spasmodic. The last of the really true cooperatives ended in the 1960s. Total of almost 1,500 houses added to the housing stock over the course of that period between 1916 and 1974. So going back to the things that Joe talked about in St. John's, then the Commission of Government's land settlements, then the cooperative houses in Corner Brook and Grand Falls, and then finally the St. John's, Bill Keogh's houses, the 513 of them under the Provincial Housing Corporation. You know, in 1990, George Anderson, president of CMHC, put this in a book. And he's saying, sometimes the history of housing isn't as well defined, as organized, as predictable as you might think that it might be. It happens by accident in the back. Taxi cabs happens for the wrong reasons, but the force of personality and the serendipity of circumstance can have as much to do with the development of policy as careful planning and analysis. So to recap this long and twisted tale, we hope that we have proved that Mr. Anderson was right. You have a cast of characters, individuals, Gorvin, Arnold, Keogh, Dunfield, Ryan, Powell, and then you have the serendipity that brought together a variety of different activities that were never intended to integrate themselves, but ended up doing so in spite of it. In the 1930s, the Commission of Government tried to establish rural farming communities based on cooperative principles. The program was not a success, but the cooperative ideal survived. In 1942, Bill Keogh, as a cooperative field officer, helped a group of Bowater employees form the first housing cooperative. That same year, in 42, Commission of Inquiry on Housing and Town Planning created, and from it came the St. John's Housing Corporation that built almost 250 houses and almost 100 apartments in St. John's, with veterans having the right of refusal in the apartments. Then the veterans on the West Coast complained that they weren't getting a fair deal, so the Commission of Government agreed to help them with cooperative housing. Then, with Confederation in 1949, brought Keogh into the cabinet, Minister of Fisheries and Cooperatives, and he brought with him the idea of housing cooperatives and monetized sweat equity, borrowing this idea from Mary Arnold, who we may or may not have met. Then in 1947, the Commission of Government realized that the houses were too expensive. They were doing nothing to solve the problems of housing in downtown St. John's. So they shut down the corporation, but left the priceless legacy, hundreds of acres of service land north of Empire Avenue, on which the housing cooperatives were able to buy their lots. Then Section 49 of the National Housing Act and CMHC put paid to the dilapidated housing in the downtown housing area through the 1950s and 60s. So Newfoundland has had an amazing history of housing initiatives. Some of them worked, some of them failed. But we must give credit to the individuals, to the governments, and to the city of St. John's for having had the courage to try out these new ideas. And the end result of all of these activities was the addition of about 1,500 new houses added to the middle class housing stock of the country and the province. And who could have imagined the unintended consequences of this sequence of unplanned events? And that's it from us.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much, Chris. And Joe, this has been a wonderful presentation. And I can see your last slide is an advertisement for a great deal for anybody that's seeing this lecture. And it's a 25% discount.
Yes, I'm sorry. I don't know why all of a sudden this has decided to stop screen sharing. I didn't.
That's okay.
Maybe Leah did. Did Leah did?
No,
Okay.
no, I don't think so.
Well, here we go. There it is.
There it is. But anyways, a 25% discount, and you have to use the coupon code STORY, STORY, and you can go to the Memorial University Press website in order to take advantage of it. I bought one of these books. I'm certainly going to buy the other one. Discount or no. So listen, thanks very much, both of you. We're at the stage now. I'm going to suggest that everybody will want, it's probably a good idea to stop sharing the screen if you can do that, and go to gallery mode so you can see everybody. And so now Leah's going to manage the chat line and the question and comment functions for this Zoom presentation. And she'll acknowledge people using the raise hand function, or she'll read from the chat line. So as again, I encourage people to go to the gallery mode so that you can see one another. Leah, do you want to?
Yes. So our first
start?
comment is from Michael, who says, wonderful presentation. I am in the process of setting up a housing co-op on Bell Island, and this presentation
Okay.
has been very helpful.
Good.
And then Jack Harris has a question.
Yep.
Where's Jack?
Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, hi, great presentation. Thanks very much. Even an old townie like me learned an awful lot about particularly the St. John's Housing Corporation area, the detail. I thought it was more monolithic than what you've expressed here today. So it's a great presentation. I tell you, one of the things that struck me is that the REWA were very successful, over 100 houses. It's probably a totally story of its own as to how that happened. But that seemed to be a remarkable achievement from one group of employees of a particular enterprise, obviously. But there may have been some driving forces behind that, obviously, that there was someone named Ryan, I think, that was part of it. I don't know if it was Joe or one of his relatives. But can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I know those Craig Miller Avenue houses and the one on Old Topsail Road as well are standout houses, are still in very good shape because people have taken pride in ownership. But that was more of I suppose, the middle class. I mean, they were regular employees, but they weren't typically middle-class people who occupied them. They were railway workers. Is there something about that you can add to this? I think it's an important part of the story of housing in St. John's.
Well, as far as I know, it was very easy, I suppose, and very well organized, because it was all within that one particular group, and they knew who their members were, and they knew their members' incomes, and they could design the program, I think, to fit the employees. They weren't asking for volunteers or advertising or anything like that. It was within their employees association. As far as I know, I think that would help to coordinate the whole project and aim it to where it was needed, and so it was successful. That I can't give you any more detail. There are various articles about it written in Newfoundland Quarterly a few years ago, which are excellent and give the details.
If I remember correctly, Joe, they had quite a struggle because they were building outside the city, and they had to convince the city to extend water and sewer.
Mm-hmm.
And it was Orion, wasn't it? That was the leading light.
Yes, it was.
I can't remember his first.
Yeah.
Can't remember his first name. But that's a pretty amazing story. But it's a one of a kind.
Okay, and Ken, Charles, and Jade all extend kudos for the talk. And then Peter Jackson has a question.
Thanks very much for the presentation. It was so enlightening. One of the slides there, it showed it was sort of the Cooperative Housing Society projects in housing areas of St. John's. And it showed my street, which is just outside of that area on Ennis Avenue. And so I was wondering, was Ennis Avenue built the same way? And, you know, where could I get that document? Where could I look for that document and just study it a bit more?
Well, that would be in the very sort of the very last co-ops, wouldn't it, Chris, that were in the late 60s over on Ennis Avenue?
Yes, I think so. And the record, I don't know that we were able to identify all the houses. The records were very poor in that last half dozen co-ops or something.
But in the back of corner windows and cul-de-sacs, we list every co-op,
No,
and the year they were built, and the address.
No, it's in Sweat Equity.
Sweat Equity?
Yeah, I'm just looking.
Okay, I'm confused. Yes, that's Sweat Equity. And so they're all listed there. You can see every co-op that was done under the project, and you might get a bit of a clue in that. But the actual documentation that we use for every co-op is in the rooms. Okay. And you have to ask them to draw it up from storage. But they do have it, and these are thick folders. They have everything in it, from the first letter that says, "Dear Sir, can we find out about your co-op program?" right the way through, and all the financial information when they were desperately trying to get the house they wanted and would their income fit, right through to the congratulations from the minister.
In the table, we don't have any Ennis Avenue, but part of the problem was we got at least 3 co-ops here that were just shown as being in the Northeast Land Assembly. And there were
Okay.
no further details. So
Well, that must be, but still I would look to the rooms.
the detailed records end in 1965, and after that, they got very iffy.
Hmm.
Okay, and Heidi Coombs has a question.
Thanks so much, Leah, and thank you, Joe and Chris. This was fantastic, and I didn't know there were so many organizations and cooperatives involved in housing in the city, and it's absolutely fascinating. I think my question goes back to some of the earlier days, and I think it was at James Street, Joe, that you were talking about earlier.
Yes.
And about how public health was in, and talking about issues with the housing in that area. And so I wonder, because I recently had a chat with my parents who are from outports in Conception Bay North, and it happens that I was asking them about, when did you get indoor plumbing? When did you get sewer and water? And how did that happen? And they were saying that out around the bay, people were responsible for their own houses, for hooking up sewer. I don't know about water, but they had to hook up the pipes and for sewer themselves. And so I wonder, was that part of the issue, that these people couldn't afford to set up that kind of infrastructure in their own homes?
Yes, that's a very good question, because that's exactly what happened. There were water lines and sewer lines put in the early part of the 20th century down in that Centretown area, but people couldn't afford to hook up. And especially people in the area we were speaking of, west of Longs Hill and north of New Gower. And it was some union leader said to the government, or to the city at the time, he said that the average income of people who work down on the harbor is $300 a year, and it was $80 to hook up to the water and sewer, so they simply couldn't afford it. So about 1910, the Mayor Ellis, he had the idea. He said, okay, we'll set up an installment plan. And that allowed people 5 years on an installment plan to pay the $80 to get a hookup. So that was one answer to the problem.
So there was no government funding really for people to.
No, and the city, there are records in the book. You'll find a letter from the city council in 1930 to the landowners for the property on Holdsworth Street. And it was 1930, and those lines had been in there for some years, and the landlord had not hooked up anybody. And they were being chased by the council, said, if you don't hook up houses by this particular date, we'll charge you $5 a day.
Wow.
So even though you see maps with the facilities in the maps and recorded, it doesn't mean, as you say, that they were necessarily inside the houses.
Right. Thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you.
And Rebecca Ralph says, wonderful talk. Also, my in-laws' family home in Gander is a co-op house. They were not the builders, but the house was bought in the early 1960s and is still in the family. And Jenny Sharp says, hi, great presentation. It gets more interesting every time I hear the story of ours and many other houses.
Yes. Well,
I've heard it all before, I'm sure.
So yes, well, I know at least one of my children was watching.
And Linda White says, just an FYI, the archives and special collections at MUN are pleased to say we house all the papers of Dr. Joe Scheuer and Dr. Chris Sharp, and we have the Dr. George Story papers.
Good.
So if anyone's interested.
Okay.
Jerry Kirkland says, great stuff. Thank you. Melissa Sam says, it looks like a worker co-op also made its own customers, which I love the idea. Karen also says, thank you. And Colleen says, as an employee currently unable supporting affordable housing, very much enjoying hearing about the history and stories. Thank you. Ken O'Brien says, James Ryan with the REWA. I live on Ryan Street, named after him.
Oh, good, yeah.
Yes.
Julie says, thank you. And Jack Harris says, there were, of course, more modern building co-ops under CMHC, some in Mount Pearl and some like the SOD, Save Our Downtown Housing Co-op, which bought and renovated and rented houses in the 80s.
Right, and the difference between those co-ops and the ones we talked about is that the later co-ops they weren't self-built. The houses were not built by the people who lived in them.
And
yeah, that's fine.
And Linda says, wonderful presentation. I live in a 1957 version of the Century Co-op houses. You can still see some of the less than skillful work in the corners. Lovely house, though.
Leah, Terry Bishop Sterling has her hand up.
Yes.
There.
Hi, Joe and Chris. Really enjoyed the presentation. Learned so much. And of course, thought back to different research I've done over the years. And just actually very recently, I've been involved in a project looking at letters to Smallwood right after Confederation. And what you said about Gander struck me because I read the letters from Grand Falls District, which included Gander. And the people were desperate for housing right after Confederation. That was, they were saying that, basically the airports were, and employees were, they were finding housing, but anybody else, there were people who had their own businesses there who said they may have to leave if they couldn't find a house. So I was interested to hear you say that, Gander was one of the areas that quickly took up the opportunities. I wasn't surprised at that. And the other thing was from an earlier period, I did research on people who were called probation officers. I call them some of the first social workers in St. John's in the late 30s and early 40s. And I remember reading their logbooks and they weren't welfare officers, but they were supposed to be helping people with various kinds of problems because of course, the idea was that, really what people needed were advice on how they could spend their money and live better and everything, not actual money, even though they were desperately poor. And they were, of course, going into many of these houses, and sometimes they would authorize or send in the welfare officers to help somebody fix up their house a little bit. But the one that I remember is, because I always thought about, gee, that was great housing policy, is just as simple as these were just simple lines, and it was like a logbook entry and said, oh, Mr. So-and-so hanging around downtown again, wants to be put somewhere. Told him to go build a shack in the woods. And it was, when you mentioned the shack houses, I sort of thought this sort of going back to the sort of early settlers, you went in the woods to try to live off the land, and so here was some poor old man, homeless man downtown, and that was the solution. Go build yourself a shack in the woods. But as I said, really enjoy the presentation.
Terry, one of the things that thinking about what you were saying, Joe and I, we didn't talk a lot about this in the presentation, but what impressed us going through these documents, and I used the term bureaucratic imagination, I think at some point in the presentation, or I intended to, maybe I forgot, but what impressed us was all of these men, even the assistant deputy administrators, were very hands-on. They knew what was going on in their portfolio every single day, writing individual letters to people. It's a kind of government that doesn't exist anymore. It can't, I suppose. But this is one of the reasons why the program was so successful, and very close cooperation between the two provincial departments and CMHC. And that may have had a great deal to do with the fact that Joe Ryan was the head of the office, and he was that kind of a person. But the public archives has all of these files with these incredible letters from politicians who were taking the time to write to individual co-ops.
Right, and people did feel that they could write to their members and deserve to receive a response. Yeah, and on a personal note, when you were talking about how people said, "Oh, nobody's going to go way out to the country there or Churchill Square," my parents moved from Goodridge Street just before I was born, in late 50s, and into Penetanguishene in what's now Airport Heights. And my older sister said they were convinced that my father was going farming because they thought that they were. So if Elizabeth Avenue was considered the country, this must have been considered like a complete outport or something.
Just with reference, Terry, to what you said earlier, going back to another project, this was Mayor Gosling at the time of the First World War, who was very socially minded in many ways. And he had a project called Roofs and Walls. And so he had a group go out and inspect houses. And if the roof or the wall or both needed mending, then he really chivied the landlords. And they made a real effort to get the landlords to do at least some basic repairs. It was semi successful because a lot of landlords wouldn't, just didn't even think about it. Or the landlords were, who knows where they were. But it was a very local initiative around town.
Yeah.
It was that situation, as you saw in Mr. Pickett's photographs, the colored ones of the area in 1952. We showed a slide of that. That was the sort of thing that Mayor Gosling was chasing after.
Mm-hmm.
And Terry, I just noticed the last message in the chat line from Lisa Sullivan, who says, "My dad, Bill Lannon, was part of the Grand Falls Memorial Avenue housing, and there are still 3 homes owned by the original owners."
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Oh, golly.
Amazing.
The original owners. Yes, we interviewed a lot of people who live in co-op houses, quite a number. Mm-hmm.
Thanks again.
And
Okay.
yeah, just and Robin says and Joe both say thank you for the presentation. They both really liked it.
Yes.
Okay, so shall we draw the evening to a close? Are there a lot of
Well,
other
I think
questions?
we should thank you for listening to such a long speech from both of us, but it was a great time to work on the books, but it's really nice to have an opportunity like this that we can sort of show it and get some reaction and see whether people are really reading them.
Good.
Right.
Okay, it's a great pleasure to thank both Chris and Joe for their presentation tonight. I'm sure you'll all join with me in thanking them for what they've been able to say to us.